His mother's hands were gray to the wrist. She crouched beside a wash kettle in the yard behind their rented house, stirring melted deer fat and sifted ash with a cracked wooden spoon until the paste stood stiff on the handle. She pressed a lump of it over the split seam of his boot, smoothed it flat with her thumb, and said, "Water hates grease more than it hates prayer." He was 10. 26 years later, he stood in a cabin where the wind blew straight through the walls, holding a lump of something that had hardened in the ash pit by accident, and remembered. Harlan Voss had not planned on Wyoming. Nobody planned on Wyoming. A man ended up there after everything better had already failed. He arrived in Johnson County in the spring of 1885 with $14 folded inside a tobacco tin. A 12-year-old nephew named Tobe Red, who had not spoken his mother's name in 2 years, and a debt ledger that followed him from Missouri like a dog that would not stop tracking scent. The rented farm outside Independence was gone. The creditors had taken the mules first, then the plow, then the right to stay. May, his wife, had said they could start over where land was cheap, and no one asked questions about what a man had lost. She was right about both things. She was also dead by March of that first year, taken by a fever that started as a cough and ended as silence in a cabin that smelled of boiled willow bark and failure. The cabin sat 12 miles from the nearest stage stop and nearly 40 miles from any store that carried lime, nails, or glass in reliable supply. 16 feet by 18 feet. Rough cottonwood logs with pine where cottonwood ran short. A stone hearth built by someone who understood fire but not mortar. The stones held, but the gaps between them wept smoke when the wind shifted. A sodden pole roof that leaked during hard rain and sagged under wet snow. The floor was packed dirt. The door was plank and hide. The logs were sound. Harlan had checked them the day he signed the note with Jory Tull. He had pressed his thumb against the grain, knocked with his knuckle, listened for the hollow thud of rot. The wood was dry, tight, and true. It was the only good thing about the place. The chinking was the problem. Whoever had built the cabin had used local clay, a pale, gritty mix pulled from a cut bank a quarter-mile south. It looked solid when wet. It packed well. It smoothed under a trowel. And every autumn, when the air dried and the temperature swung 30 degrees between noon and midnight, it cracked. Not hairline cracks, gaps, fingers of daylight between the logs where the clay had shrunk away from the wood and fallen in chunks to the ground. Harlan had re-chinked twice since arriving. Both times the clay held through summer and failed before the first hard frost. When the wind came down the Powder River breaks, and it always came, it did not whistle through the cracks. It poured. Harlan had watched ash stir in the cold hearth from a gust that entered through the north wall, crossed the room, and exited through a gap on the south side. The cabin was not shelter. It was a sieve with a roof. He owed Jory Tull for the cabin note. He owed Tull for May's burial. He owed Tull for the trapping license fee that Tull had fronted as a favor that was not a favor. The debts were not large by Eastern standards, $41 total, but $41 was a wall that a man earning pelts in a poor season could not climb. Beaver were scarce. Muskrat brought almost nothing. Coyote and fox moved in patterns Harlan was still learning. Wolf pelts paid well, but wolves were smart and traps were few. He owned 4 steel traps in good order. He needed 12. Tobe did not complain. That was the worst part. A 12-year-old boy who had lost his mother to abandonment and his aunt to fever should have complained. He should have kicked at things and refused to haul water. Instead, he hauled water. He split kindling with a hatchet that was too heavy for his arms. He ate beans without comment and slept on a pallet near the hearth and woke before dawn to feed the fire because he had learned that if the fire died, the cabin became a place where breath hung visible before a man finished exhaling. By November of 1886, Harlan had 2 sacks of flour, 20 pounds of beans, 40 pounds of coffee he could not afford to drink and planned to trade, one stovepipe with a dent that narrowed the draw, 4 working traps, and 1¼ cords of firewood stacked against the east wall. 1¼ cords. He said the number to himself while standing in the yard, looking at the stack and feeling the air bite through his coat at the seams where his elbows had worn the wool thin. He said it again. 1¼ Calvin Strake arrived on a Tuesday. Strake was 61 years old and had wintered cattle in Wyoming Territory for 25 years. He rode for the Rocking H, which ran stock across 80,000 acres of grass that was no longer as thick as it had been 5 years ago. He was not a cruel man. He was not a kind man. He was a man who had survived enough winters to know exactly what it cost, and he had no patience for anyone who pretended the cost was negotiable. He did not dismount at first. He sat his horse and looked at the cabin the way a doctor looks at a patient who has waited too long to ask for help. Then he swung down, tied the horse to the rail Harlan had built from a cottonwood pole, and walked the perimeter without speaking. Harlan followed 3 steps behind. Toby watched from the doorway. Strake pressed his palm flat against the north wall. He held it there for 5 seconds. Then he pulled it away and looked at his hand as though the wall had told him something private. "You feel that?" Strake said. Harlan did not answer because the answer was obvious. Air moved through the north wall like water through a sieve. Strake crouched at the base where the lowest log met the foundation stones. He put his face near the gap and squinted. Then he stood, brushed his knees, and walked to the west wall. He repeated the inspection. He checked the corners where the logs notched together. He looked at the roof edge where sod met log and found daylight in 3 places. "How much wood you have?" Strake said. It was not a question shaped like a question. It was a man confirming something he already knew. 1¼ cord, Harlan said. Strake looked at the stack. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the sky, which was low and the color of dirty tin. "You need 6 cords if that wall holds," Strake said. 8 if it don't. You have 1¼ a cracked stovepipe, and daylight showing between half your logs. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Harlan felt Tobey shift in the doorway behind him. "The clay won't set," Harlan said. "I've packed it twice. It shrinks by October." "I know it shrinks," Strake said. "Everybody on this stretch knows it shrinks. That cut-bank clay is half-eight. You need lime mortar mixed with cattle hair and packed wet, then plastered inside and out. Or you need an interior plank lining. Either one takes material you don't have." "How much for lime?" Harlan said. $2.20 a sack at Tull's, if Tull has it. He don't stock it regular. Nearest reliable supply is Brannock's in Buffalo, and that's 38 miles by road. You'd need a wagon team in 2 days minimum. You don't own a wagon team." "I don't." Strake looked at Tobe. The boy stood straight, thin as a fence rail, holding the door frame with one hand. Strake looked away. "You could burn that cabin to the ground for warmth, and it might last you 10 days, Strake said. "After that, you're sleeping in a snow trench." He pulled his gloves tighter and walked to his horse. "I'm not saying this to be hard. I'm saying it because the last man who tried to winter in a cabin with walls like that was Lem Pardee, and they found him in February sitting up in his chair with his boots still on." He mounted and rode north without looking back. Harlan stood in the yard and listened to the hooves fade. The wind came through the breaks, crossed the open grass, hit the north wall, and poured through every crack like the cabin was not there at all. Inside, the hearth fire flickered as if someone had blown on it from outside. Toby said, "How many cords is enough?" Harlan said, "More than we have." The boy nodded. He went back inside. Harlan heard him add a stick to the fire, one stick carefully because they both counted now. That night, Harlan lay on his pallet and did the math that kept men awake in country like this. $14. Flour for maybe 6 weeks if they stretched it. Beans for 5. Coffee worth something in trade, but nothing in a stove. 4 traps. A season that had given him 11 pelts so far. 7 muskrat, 2 coyote, 1 fox, 1 beaver. worth maybe $9 total if the buyer at the stage stop paid fair, which the buyer at the stage stop never did. He needed 6 cords of wood at minimum. Cutting and splitting a cord of cottonwood and pine took a strong man 2 full days. 6 cords meant 12 days of nothing but swinging an axe, and he could not stop trapping for 12 days because trapping was the only income that might chip at the debt before Tull decided patience was no longer profitable. He needed lime for proper chinking, 38 miles each way. A wagon he did not own. Money he did not have. Even if someone loaned a team, 2 days of hauling was 2 days not cutting wood and not running traps. He could not leave. The debt note said if he abandoned the property, the cabin and its contents reverted to Tull. May was buried 200 yards south under a cairn of river stones. Toby had no mother to go back to and no kin willing to take a boy who ate more than he earned. The stage stop was 12 miles of open ground, and even if Harlan reached it with the boy, a ticket east cost more than everything he owned. The escape hatch was shut. Every door was a wall. He ran his palm along the log beside his pallet and felt the air coming through. Not a gust. A steady, thin current of cold that would not stop until spring, and spring was 5 months away. The realization did not come as an idea. It came as an accident. Harlan ran his trapline 3 days after Strake's visit, working a creek bottom where beaver had built a dam the previous spring. He took 1 beaver and 2 muskrat. The beaver was thin, bad sign this early, but the pelt was fair and the carcass had enough fat to render for trade. Rancid tallow still had value for rough candles, axle grease, and the soap makers who bought anything animal at 3 cents a pound. He rendered the fat that evening in an iron kettle balanced on the hearth stones. The smell filled the cabin, hot, greasy, sharp, and Tobe sat near the door to breathe cleaner air. Harlan skimmed the surface, poured off the liquid fat into a tin, and set the kettle aside. After midnight, Toby stumbled against the hearth in the dark. His foot caught the ladle, a scoop of warm tallow, not hot enough to burn, but liquid enough to pour, spilled into the ash pit beside the hearth. Harlan heard the sound and said, "Leave it." By morning, the spill had cooled. The tallow had mixed with the fine gray ash and hardened into a pale, gritty lump the size of a man's 2 fists pressed together. Harlan crouched beside the hearth to clean it out. He tried to scoop the lump with his hand. It did not break. He pried at it with a knife. The blade skated across the surface, leaving a shallow scratch but not splitting the mass. He picked it up. It was dense, smooth where the ash had packed tight, rough where air pockets had formed. He turned it in his hands. Then he carried it to the door, set it on the threshold, and watched. Snow drifted against it. The flakes beaded on the surface and rolled away. Water did not soak in. The wind did not chip the edge. 3 things. Snow beaded on it. His knife skated across it. The wind had not broken its surface. He held the lump and smelled the bitter grease, and something shifted in the back of his mind. Not a thought, exactly. A feeling. The smell of hot fat and wood ash together, and a kitchen in Missouri 15 years ago, and his mother's hands covered in gray dust up to her wrists. Caddy Voss had boiled deer fat in a wash kettle in the yard behind their rented house outside Independence. She had sifted hardwood ash through a piece of torn bed sheet, and the fine powder had fallen into a basin like gray snow. She mixed the ash into the melted fat with a cracked wooden spoon and stirred until the paste was stiff enough to stand on the spoon without running. Then she took a lump of the cooled mixture, pressed it over a split seam on Harlan's boot, where water came in during creek crossings, and smoothed it flat with her thumb. "Water hates grease more than it hates prayer," she said. Harlan was 10. He remembered the candlelight on the spoon, the bitter clean smell of the lye forming where the ash met the fat, and the way his boot stayed dry for 3 weeks after until the paste wore through. He stood in the doorway of his cabin in Wyoming Territory, 26 years later, holding a lump of accidental tallow and ash, and looked at the north wall where daylight showed between the logs. Grease sheds water, ash stiffens grease, cold hardens both. A smooth surface gives wind less to grab. He tested the idea that afternoon. He melted what remained of the beaver tallow, roughly 20 pounds, in the kettle, skimmed out the grit and hair with a cloth, and set it aside. Then he sifted wood ash through a doubled piece of burlap, slowly, watching the fine gray powder fall and leaving behind the charcoal chunks and unburned splinters. He mixed the ash into the warm tallow, adding it in handfuls and stirring with a paddle until the paste became thick enough to hold ridges. He chose one seam on the north wall, the worst one, a gap between the third and fourth logs where he could fit 3 fingers and feel wind on his knuckle. The failed clay still clung in patches. He did not scrape it all away. He pressed the tallow ash paste over the clay, into the gap, working it deep with his fingers and then smoothing the surface with a board he had warmed near the fire. The paste went in soft and gray-white. It filled the gap like mortar, but with a greasy sheen that the clay had never had. He smoothed it flat. He stepped back. Tobe held a candle near the sealed seam. The flame stood straight, not a flicker. By dawn, the paste had hardened in the sub-freezing air. Harlan pressed his palm against the patch. No air. He ran his fingernail across the surface. The nail left a mark, but did not dig in. He put his face close to the seam and inhaled. Cold air came from the gaps on either side of the patch, but nothing came through the patch itself. One seam, one patch, one small silence where the wind used to pour through. The test worked, but one patch was not a cabin. Usksin Merritt Kale showed up 2 days later, not because anyone had invited him, but because sound travels in flat country and smoke from Harlan's rendering kettle had been visible for a mile. Merritt was 42. He had a half-finished barn, 3 children under 10, a wife named Abigail who could stretch a sack of flour into 6 weeks of meals that tasted like penance, and a deep suspicion of any method that had not been proven by someone older and more successful than himself. He was not cruel. He was careful, which in a hard country looked nearly the same. He stood in Harlan's yard and looked at the north wall where the single test patch gleamed pale against the dark, cracked clay surrounding it. "What is that?" Merritt said. "Tallow and ash," Harlan said. Merritt stepped closer. He touched the patch with one finger, then pulled his hand back and looked at the grease on his fingertip. He wiped it on his coat. "You're going to grease your house and call that carpentry?" Merritt asked. "I'm going to stop the wind," Harlan said. "Carpentry costs 38 miles and money I don't have." Merritt walked the perimeter the way Strake had, but slower, with less authority and more worry. He was not assessing Harlan's chances. He was assessing his own. If Harlan's cabin failed, Merritt's was next in line for the same wind, and Merritt's chinking was the same cursed cutbank clay. "Grease draws animals," Merritt said. "Dogs, coyotes, wolves if they're hungry enough." "I know," Harlan said. "Fire," Merritt said. "Near a stovepipe, near a chimney." "I know." "Summer sun, that south wall faces the afternoon. It'll melt and slide right off." "Maybe," Harlan said. "I don't need it to last until summer. I need it to last until spring." Merritt looked at the patch again. He crouched and put his face near the wall, the way Strake had, the way Harlan himself had done. He held still. Then he stood. "No air," he said. Not a compliment, an observation. A man recording a fact he could not yet trust. "If I'm wrong," Harlan said, "I've wasted 20 pounds of trade fat and a week of labor, and I'm the fool everybody already thinks I am. If I'm right, that wall holds heat, and I burned 2 cords instead of 8. "If you're wrong," Merritt said, "you've got no trade goods and no shelter, and that boy of yours freezes in a cabin that smells like a rendering pit." That's the gamble, Harlan said. Merritt left without offering help. He did not say good luck. He did not say it would work. He walked back across the flat with his hands in his coat pockets and his shoulders hunched against the wind, and Harlan watched him go and knew that every word Merritt had spoken was a word Harlan had already said to himself in the dark. The rumor reached Toll's store before Harlan finished the second wall. That was the nature of country like this. A man could live 40 miles from a supply store and 12 miles from the nearest stage stop, and somehow the news that he was smearing animal fat on his cabin would travel faster than a letter on horseback. The men who gathered at Toll's store, cowboys waiting out the season, freighters killing time, ranch hands spending wages on tobacco and whiskey, had opinions about everything and expertise in nothing, and Harlan Voss became their entertainment before he became their problem. Deacon Marr, who rode for the rocking H when there was work and drank at Toll's when there was not, told the best version of the joke. He had ridden past Harlan's place and slowed his horse to stare at the north wall, which by then was fully coated, smooth, pale, greasy, the logs invisible under a layer of tallow-ash paste that caught the weak November light and glowed like something that did not belong on a building. "Looks like a candle big enough for God to blow out," Marr said, and the store laughed. Others added their own. The cabin looked like a whitewashed coffin. It would melt in the first warm spell. It would draw every wolf in the county. A man who buttered his house had confessed he could not keep it. That last one was not a joke. It was Jory Toll's line, and Toll did not say it to be funny. Jory Toll was 50 years old, owned the store, held paper on half the smallholders in the county, and had the patience of a man who understood that debt was a harvest that required no planting. He had fronted Harlan the burial cost, the trapping license, and the cabin note because the cabin site sat on good water with a natural windbreak of cottonwoods. And Toll wanted it for a line shack he could lease to passing ranch outfits for spring roundup. If Harlan paid the debt, Toll made money. If Harlan failed, Toll made more. The mathematics of usury required no weather and no livestock, only a borrower who could not quite keep up. Toll arrived at Harlan's cabin on a gray afternoon with Deacon Marr and two hands from the rocking H whose names Harlan did not know. They rode in a line, which was the way men rode when they wanted to look official. Harlan was on a short ladder pressing tallow-ash paste under the eaves of the west wall. His hands were gray to the wrist. The smell of rendered fat hung in the cold air like a curtain. Toll dismounted. He walked to the north wall and pressed a gloved finger into the coating. The paste had been cured for 4 days and was firm, but the surface gave slightly under pressure. Toll pulled his finger away and brought it to his nose. "You coated the collateral," Toll said. "I sealed the walls," Harlan said from the ladder. "A man who smears carrion fat on collateral has confessed he can't keep it," Toll said. Harlan came down from the ladder. He wiped his hands on a rag that was already black with ash. He stood 3 feet from Toll and 2 feet below him because Toll had not stepped off the slight rise near the woodpile. "How much does lime cost a sack, freight included?" Harlan asked. Toll's face did not change. $2.20 a sack." "How many sacks did Strake say I'd need to do this right?" Toll did not answer. The question was not the kind a debtor was supposed to ask. A debtor was supposed to explain, apologize, promise to do better. A debtor was not supposed to make the creditor do arithmetic that proved the creditor's own remedy was impossible. "I asked Strake," Harlan said. "He said 12 sacks minimum for a cabin this size, inside and out. That's $26.40 for lime alone, before freight. Freight from Buffalo at winter rates is another $8 to $10. Call it $35 for the repair you say I should have made." He paused. "My total debt to you is $41. You're telling me to spend $35 I don't have to protect a $41 note you're already holding." Toll's mouth thinned. Deacon Marr shifted in his saddle. The two hands looked at the ground. What I'm telling you, Tull said, is that property defaced is property forfeit under the terms. Show me where the terms say that, Harlan said. Tull did not answer because the terms did not say that. The terms said the property reverted upon abandonment or non-payment. They said nothing about chinking method, wall coating, or the smell of a man's collateral. Tull remounted. He looked at the cabin, the two finished walls, pale and strange, the two unfinished walls showing dark logs and crumbling clay, the boy watching from the window with wide, still eyes. I'll be back, Tull said. Harlan did not respond. He climbed back up the ladder and pressed another double handful of paste under the eaves. Behind him, he heard the horses turn and the hooves soften in the grass as Tull and his men rode back toward the road. Tobe came outside. He looked at the pale wall, then at Harlan. Will he call the note? Toby asked. He can't, Harlan said. Not yet. When can he? Harlan did not answer because the honest answer was, whenever a man like that decided the rules were whatever he said they were. Law was 38 miles away, same as lime. He needed hundreds of pounds of fat, and he could not kill enough game quickly to get it. The math was ugly. The cabin was 16 by 18 feet. The walls stood 7 feet. Each wall face was more than 100 square feet of surface, inside and out. 8 wall faces total, plus the seams, plus the eave edges, plus the gaps around the door frame and the window. At half an inch of paste over the seams and a thinner skim across the log faces, Harlan calculated he needed somewhere near 300 pounds of rendered tallow mixed with 200 pounds of sifted ash. 300 pounds. He had used 20 on the test patch and the north wall. He had another 30 pounds of rough fat from trapped animals waiting to be rendered. That left 250 pounds short, and the weather was not going to wait while he caught up. He started collecting what others threw away. At the stage stop, he traded 2 muskrat pelts for a barrel of rancid beef trim that the cook had been about to bury. At a ranch camp south of the breaks, he offered to haul away the gut pile and sweet from a steer they had slaughtered, work no one wanted, carried out in a stinking burlap sack slung over his shoulder for 3 miles. He saved every scrap of fat from his own traps, coyote tallow, beaver tail grease, the thin layer of fat under muskrat skin. He cracked marrow bones and boiled them in his kettle, skimming the oily film into a separate tin. Some of it stank. Some was full of hair and grit. Some had to be cut away from meat that had already turned green at the edges. Toby gagged the first time he helped pour rancid sweet into the rendering kettle, and Harlan said, "Breathe through your mouth and keep stirring," because there was no gentler version of the work. They rendered fat in the iron kettle for hours, feeding the fire beneath it with wood they could not afford to burn for any other purpose. The cabin filled with greasy smoke. They slept in shifts so the fire would not flare and scorch the fat, which would make it brittle instead of smooth. The ash they collected from every fire, hearth ash, rendering ash, the neighbor's ash pile that Merritt let them shovel without comment. And the cabin changed, wall by wall, seam by seam, from a structure made of dark logs and crumbling clay into something that no one in the Powder River breaks had ever seen before. The paste went on gray-white and hardened to a smooth, pale surface that caught the light differently than wood or clay. The logs disappeared. The seams disappeared. The cracks disappeared. What remained was a shape that looked less like a cabin and more like a sealed lantern, a single smooth shell with no edges for the wind to find. A week into the work, Harlan had coated 30 feet of seam. Not enough. The temperature dropped 4 degrees overnight. Toby woke coughing. The fire had burned low. 2 weeks in, the north wall was finished and the west wall was half done. The south and east walls waited. The roof edge waited. The chimney side, the most dangerous section where grease and flame could not meet, waited. Harlan checked his remaining tallow, 60 pounds short of what he needed. He checked the sky. The clouds had changed. They were no longer high and thin. They sat low and heavy, and the color had shifted from gray to a green gray that men in Wyoming learned to read the way sailors read the horizon. The storm was coming. He could feel it in the air, in the way the cattle drifted south along the breaks, in the way ravens gathered around winter-killed stock as if stalking their own larders. The grass was cropped to dirt across every flat. The range was overgrazed, the cattle thin, and the sky promised something that thin cattle in short grass could not survive. 10 days before the expected hard freeze, Harlan was 60 pounds of tallow short and 2 walls unfinished. 6 days before storm sign, the roof edge was still exposed. 3 days before the first major blow, the chimney side, the wall where fire met fat, where Orrin Quill would later say a man's life hung on 18 inches of clearance, was still bare logs and broken clay. And the weather was not waiting. Orrin Quill did not introduce himself. He appeared. Harlan was scraping frost from the west wall with a flat iron, preparing the surface for the next layer of paste, when a man he had never seen stepped around the corner of the cabin and stood watching. He was 68 years old, though he looked older, thin in a way that suggested the thinness had been earned over decades rather than delivered by a single bad season. His coat was army surplus, patched at the elbows with leather that had gone dark with grease. He was missing the last 2 fingers on his left hand, the stumps healed smooth and white. He did not speak. He watched Harlan scrape frost for 30 seconds, then walked to the north wall where the cured tallow-ash coating had been in place for a week. He ran his right palm across the surface. He pressed his thumbnail into it. He crouched at the base where the coating met the foundation stones and looked at the seam where cold air might try to creep under the seal. Then he stood and said, "You put this on while the log still held frost." Harlan stopped scraping. "What?" "This section." Will pointed to a spot near the northeast corner, where the coating had a faint crack running diagonally, not deep enough to let wind through, but visible. "The log was frozen when you pressed the paste. Fat don't bond to frost. It sits on top. When the log warms from inside and the frost melts, the layer lifts and cracks at the edge." Harlan looked at the crack. He had noticed it 2 days ago and assumed it was the cold working the material. He had planned to patch it. "Who are you?" Harlan said. "Orrin Quill," the man said. "I dressed hides for the army near Fort Laramie for 11 years. Before that, I boiled soap for a sutler's wife. Before that, I was a laundress's assistant at Fort Kearny, which is a job they give to men who can't do anything else, and a job that teaches you everything about grease, ash, lye, and what cold does to all three." He said this without pride or apology. It was a list of facts, delivered the way a man reads the contents of a shelf. "You know rendering," Harlan said. "I know rendering, ash handling, how grease behaves at 0 degrees, and how it behaves at 40 below. I know what happens when you mix too much ash and the paste turns chalky and breaks. I know what happens when you mix too little and it stays soft enough for a dog to chew through in an hour." He looked at the cabin. "I also know that what you're doing here is either the smartest thing anyone in this valley has tried or the dumbest, and I walked 2 miles in the cold to find out which." Harlan said, "I don't have money to pay you." "I didn't ask for money," Quill said. "I asked myself a question and came here to answer it." He pointed at the crack near the northeast corner again. "Warm the seam before you apply. Pan of coals held near the wall, close enough to sweat the frost but not close enough to dry the wood. Scrape the melt, then press the paste. It bonds to dry wood. not to ice. He said it the way a man says something he has said before to someone else in a different place, about a different material. The knowledge was not new. The application was. That was the first lesson. Orrin stayed, not because Harlan asked him to, and not because Orrin had nowhere else to go. He kept a room at the stage stop, paid for in trade labor and occasional soap making, but because he recognized something in the test patch that interested him more than comfort. He told Harlan this on the second day, while they rendered a bucket of rancid beef sweat that smelled like something that had died twice. "I've seen men try to seal a building with grease before," Orrin said. "Wagon covers, tent seams, boot leather. It works small. Nobody tries it big because the amount of fat you need for a whole structure is more than most people can get their hands on, and the work is disgusting, and it looks insane." He paused. "You're doing it big. I want to see if big works." He taught through action. He did not lecture. He stood beside Harlan and showed him. The second lesson was ash grading. Coarse ash with charcoal chunks and unburned splinters weakened the coating because the rough particles created air pockets that let moisture seep in and freeze crack the layer from inside. Fine ash, sifted through 2 layers of flour sack, 1 coarse pass to remove the chunks, 1 fine pass through tighter weave to catch the grit, produced a powder that mixed into the tallow like flour into dough. The result was denser, smoother, and harder when cured. Orrin showed Harlan how to build a sifting frame from 2 sticks and a piece of doubled cloth. He showed Toby how to feed the ash slowly, shaking the frame in a steady rhythm, watching the fine gray powder fall into the basin below. Tobe's arms ached after 20 minutes. Orrin told him to switch hands and keep going. The third lesson was layer timing. Press the first layer deep into the crack, working it with fingers and a flat stick until the paste filled every gap between the logs. Let that layer skin over 4 to 6 hours in freezing air, longer if the temperature was above 20 degrees. Then apply the weather face, a smoother, thinner layer pressed flat with a warmed board. Too much paste applied at once would slump under its own weight and pull away from the log before it hardened. "You're not building a wall," Orrin said. "You're building a skin. Skin holds because it's thin and tight. A thick slab of grease will slide off a log the same way a thick slab of mud slides off a hillside." The fourth lesson was grease purification. Raw rendered fat contained blood, tissue fibers, and mineral grit that weakened the final product. Orrin showed Harlan how to boil the rendered tallow with water in the kettle, let it cool overnight, then lift the fat cake off the top. The impurities settled to the bottom of the water. The underside of the fat cake was dark and rough where it had released the worst of the grit. Orrin scraped the underside clean with a knife, and the remaining fat was paler, smoother, and set harder when it cooled. "Purified fat is what keeps a candle from stinking," Orrin said. "Same principle, clean grease, clean seal." The fifth lesson was the fire break. No tallow-ash paste within 18 inches of the stovepipe. No paste within 12 inches of the chimney stones. Those zones got stone, bare mud, and if Harlan could beg or trade for it, a small amount of lime plaster from anyone willing to share. Grease near fire was not a risk, it was a certainty. The flash point of tallow was well below a chimney's surface temperature during a hard burn, and a cabin sealed in fat that caught fire from its own chimney was not a survival story. It was a funeral. "This is the rule that matters more than all the others," Orrin said. "You can get the ash wrong and the wall cracks. You can get the thickness wrong and the wall sags. You get the fire break wrong and you die." Harlan measured 18 inches from the stovepipe with a knotted string. He marked the line on the wall with charcoal. Everything inside that line stayed bare. Orrin's history came out in pieces, the way a man's history always does when he's working beside someone, and the silence gets long enough to fill. He had lost the 2 fingers to frostbite at Fort Laramie during a January when the temperature did not rise above zero for 19 straight days. He had been hauling laundry kettles, 100-pound iron pots full of boiling water and lye, from the wash house to the drying lines, and the water slopped over his gloves and froze before he could wipe it away. By the time the surgeon looked at his hand, the last 2 fingers on his left were black to the second knuckle. "The Army gave me a discharge and $4, Orrin said. "The sutler's wife gave me a job boiling soap because I already knew the kettles and didn't complain about the smell. I learned more about fat and ash and lye in that soap kitchen than most men learn about anything in their whole lives." He said this while scraping frost from a log with the 3 remaining fingers of his left hand, working the iron as steadily as a man with 5. He did not look at his hand when he spoke about it. He looked at the wall. He respected Harlan because Harlan tested before boasting. That was what Orrin said on the 3rd day when Harlan asked why he kept coming back. Most men would have told everyone at the store what they'd figured out before they'd finished the first wall, Orrin said. "You sealed the north wall, sat with it for a week, checked it every morning, and didn't say a word to anyone. That's how a hairdresser works. You test the solution on a scrap before you commit the whole skin." "I didn't know if it would hold," Harlan said. "That's the point," Orrin said. "You didn't know, and you didn't pretend you did." They worked side by side through the short November days. Orrin moved slowly but did not stop. Harlan moved faster but had to rest more often because the work was brutal, hauling kettles, stirring boiling fat, sifting ash until the dust coated every surface of his skin, pressing paste into seams until his fingers cracked and bled from the ash, lie eating into the splits. Tobey ran between them, carrying water, feeding fires, holding boards flat against fresh-pressed paste while the surface skinned over. The cabin changed. Wall by wall, the dark logs and crumbling clay vanished under the pale shell. The building lost its edges. Corners that had been sharp notches of bare wood became smooth curves where paste filled the gaps and rounded the profile. The roof edge, where sod met log and wind found its easiest entry, received the thickest layer, nearly an inch of stiff, ash-heavy paste pressed into every seam and dusted with dry ash to reduce the tackiness. Harlan's hands cracked from the ash lye. The skin between his fingers split and wept clear fluid that stung when the cold hit it. He wrapped his hands in strips of cloth at night and soaked them in warm water, but by morning the wraps were stiff with dried blood, and he had to peel them away to start again. Tobe coughed from the rendering smoke. The cough started dry and became wet over 3 days. Harlan made him sleep near the door, where the air was cleaner, but the door was also where the cold came in, and the boy chose smoke over cold without being told. Progress markers measured hope and dread in equal portions. First week with Orrin, north and west walls complete. 60 feet of seam sealed. The cabin drew noticeably less on the finished sides. Harlan could hold his hand near the north wall and feel nothing. On the unfinished south wall, the wind still poured through like the logs were not there. Second week, south wall half done. East wall started. Tallow supply dropped below 100 pounds. Orrin calculated they needed at least 60 more to finish the east wall, the roof edge, and the critical seams around the door frame. 8 days before the temperature sign changed, Harlan traded his last fox pelt for 2 buckets of beef tallow from a ranch cook who had been saving it for candle making. The cook charged double what the fat was worth and knew Harlan could not argue. 6 days out, a warm afternoon, 38 degrees, almost balmy, and the south wall sweated. The surface went soft. A section near the base sagged and pulled away from the log in a slow, greasy curtain. Harlan and Orrin cut the sagged section away with a paddle, reapplied thinner, waited for cold to return, and pressed it flat again after dark when the temperature dropped back below 20. "South face is going to do that every time the sun hits it," Orrin said. Thinner on this wall. More ash, less fat. You want it chalky, not greasy. 5 days out, dogs from the stage stop found the cabin. 2 of them. They chewed at a low patch on the east wall where the paste was fresh and the animal smell was strong. Harlan heard the scratching at midnight and chased them with a stick. They had gouged a section the size of his palm. He repaired it at dawn with a stiffer mix, more ash, less fat, dusted heavy with dry clay from the cut bank. Orrin said the clay dust would cut the smell. It was the only useful thing the local clay had done. 4 days out, ash supply ran low. 3 days of wet snow had dampened the fire pit and turned the ash to gray sludge. Harlan spent half a day drying ash in a pan near the stove, a job that produced heat, smoke, and fine dust that settled on everything in the cabin. Toby's cough worsened. 3 days out, Tull's hired man, a cowboy named Garvin, whom Harlan had seen at the store but never spoken to, rode past the cabin and knocked a cooling kettle off the stump where it sat with his horse's shoulder. The kettle hit the frozen ground and cracked. 15 pounds of rendered tallow spilled into the dirt. Garvin said the horse had shied. Harlan looked at the angle in the distance and said nothing. He scraped what he could from the ground. He lost maybe 10 pounds, 10 pounds he did not have. 2 days before the first blow, Merritt Cale walked across the flat carrying 2 buckets of beef sweet. Harlan saw him coming from a quarter-mile away, a man shaped like a question mark, bent forward under the weight of the buckets, crossing open ground in a wind that had teeth. He set the buckets down in Harlan's yard and straightened his back with a wince. My youngest woke up with frost on her blanket, Merritt said. Inside the cabin, on the blanket. Harlan looked at the buckets. 20 pounds of sweet, maybe more. Enough to finish the east wall and start the door frame. I don't have to believe in it to want to see if it holds, Merritt said. He did not stay. He picked up the empty buckets he had brought and walked home across the flat, leaning into the wind, and Harlan watched him go and understood that doubt and hope lived in the same house and sometimes carried the same buckets. By mid-December of 1886, the cabin was coated. The logs had disappeared. What stood in the yard 12 miles from the stage stop was a shape that did not look like any building in the Powder River breaks. Smooth, pale, ash-dusted. The surface caught the winter light and held it, not quite glowing, but not quite dull, like a block of dirty wax carved into the shape of a house. The corners were rounded where paste had filled the notches. The eaves were sealed tight. The door frame was lined with a double thickness of stiff, ash-heavy paste that Orrin had insisted on because doors were where people broke seals by opening and closing them. The chimney side was the last section finished. Harlan and Orrin had spent a full day on it, working slowly, measuring the fire break with Harlan's knotted string before pressing a single handful of paste. 18 inches of bare stone and mud around the chimney. 18 inches of bare wall around the stovepipe. Everything outside those zones was sealed. It looked absurd. Harlan stood in the yard and looked at it and knew it looked absurd. A cabin was supposed to look like logs and mortar, dark and solid and ordinary. This looked like something a child had shaped from candle drippings and ash. But inside, the difference was immediate. Harlan held a candle near the north wall. The flame stood straight. He moved to the west wall, straight. East wall, straight. South wall, where the coating was thinnest and the afternoon sun was a future problem. The flame bent slightly near the window frame where the seal was imperfect, but everywhere else it held. 1 armload of wood kept coals alive until morning. Before the coating, Harlan had been feeding the fire 3 times a night. Frost stopped forming along the lower seams where cold air used to pool against the floor. Meltwater from the roof beaded on the coated sill and ran off instead of soaking into the wood. Orrin performed his own test. He lit a tallow candle. held it at arm's length, and walked the interior perimeter slowly, watching the flame. When he reached the chimney side, where the fire break left bare stone and mud, the flame flickered. Everywhere else it held. Small weather proves nothing, Oren said. A calm freeze at 10 degrees is a lullaby. Wind at 30 below is the test. Wind finds corners, eaves, and every place where your coating meets stone. If there is a gap the size of a needle, the wind will find it and open it to the size of a finger, and a finger-sized gap at 30 below will drain a cabin faster than you can feed the fire. He pointed to a hairline crack near the chimney stones, the edge of the fire break where tallow-ash paste met bare mortar. The crack was barely visible. That will talk when the wind comes, Oren said. Harlan looked at the crack. I can patch it. Not with fat. Too close to the chimney. You need lime or hard clay, and you don't have either. Calvin Strake returned 3 days after the coating was finished. He did not ride this time. He walked, which meant he had come from somewhere close, probably the Rocky Nate South Line Camp. He stood in the yard and looked at the cabin for a long time without touching it. It draws less, Strake said. He did not explain how he knew. A man who had wintered in Wyoming for 25 years could feel the difference between a sealed building and a leaking one from 20 feet away, the way a carpenter can hear a loose joint without touching the wood. Grease and ash, Strake said. Not a question. Tallow and sifted ash, Harlan said. Mixed thick, applied in layers. Strake walked closer. He pressed his palm against the south wall. He pulled it away and looked at the grease on his hand. He rubbed it between his fingers. How close to the chimney? Strake said. 18 inches clear. That's not enough if the stovepipe shifts. The pipe is braced. Strake looked at the stovepipe exit where it passed through the roof. He looked at the brace, a piece of iron strap Harlan had bent around the pipe and nailed to a roof pole. Strake did not comment on it. His silence was its own kind of verdict. This is not daubing, Strake said. This is not chinking. I don't know what this is. If it holds through a real blow, you've solved the wrong problem in the right way. If it doesn't hold, you've wasted a season's worth of trade fat and you're back where you started with less. He left. The sky behind him was the color that men in Wyoming had learned to stop pretending they could not read. Low, green-gray, heavy with a pressure that was not rain and not snow and not wind, but the promise of all three arriving together. Jory Tull came the next day, riding alone this time. He did not dismount. He sat his horse and looked at the pale cabin, and his face carried an expression that was not mockery and not anger and not concern. It was the expression of a man watching a debt become harder to collect. He said nothing. He turned his horse and rode back toward the store. The cattle knew before the men did. For 3 days they had been drifting south along the breaks, pressed by something they could feel and the ranchers could not yet see. They moved in loose, unhurried groups, heads down, grazing as they walked but walking steadily, always south. The grass they cropped was short. The range had been overgrazed through the summer and fall, and what remained was stubble that provided motion without nourishment. The cattle were thin. They had been thin since October. Ravens gathered around the first winter-killed stock, a yearling steer that had gone down in a draw a mile east of Harlan's cabin. By the second day, there were 4 dead cattle visible from the ridge above the breaks. By the third day, the ravens were fat, and the coyotes had stopped being cautious about daylight. Oren watched the sky from Harlan's yard on the morning of the 4th day and said, "Tomorrow night, maybe the night after. Not later than that." "How do you know?" Tobe asked. "The clouds stopped moving," Oren said. When clouds stop moving, they're waiting for something bigger to push them. That afternoon, the temperature rose. It climbed from 12 degrees to 28 in 6 hours, a thaw that felt like mercy and was not. The snow crust softened. Water ran in thin sheets across the frozen ground. The air smelled wet and almost warm. Men at the stage stop came outside without coats. A cowboy at the Rocking H's line camp washed his shirt and hung it on a fence rail. Orrin did not take off his coat. He sat near Harlan's stove and said, "The thaw is the loaded gun. When the temperature falls again, it falls fast and it falls far, and everything that melted freezes into a crust that cattle can't break through to graze. That's what kills the herds, not the snow. The ice under the snow." By evening, the temperature had dropped back to 18. By midnight, it was 6. The water that had run across the ground during the thaw was now a sheet of ice that caught moonlight and threw it back in flat, pale angles. Harlan woke to the sound of wind, not the steady wind that came down the breaks every day and poured through the cracks in every cabin in the county. This was different. This wind had a voice. It came from the north, and it did not gust. It pressed. A constant, heavy pressure that bent the cottonwoods along the creek and drove snow horizontally across the flat. The temperature at dawn was 14 below zero. By noon, it had not risen. By afternoon, powder snow was moving sideways so fast that Harlan could not see the woodpile from the door. Inside the cabin, the stove burned steady. Harlan had banked it with a full load of cottonwood and pine before dawn, and the iron radiated heat that pushed back against the cold leaking in from where? He held his palm against the north wall. Nothing. The tallow-ash shell was solid, dense, and the surface was cold but not frost-rimed. No air came through. West wall. Nothing. South wall. A faint current near the window frame, where the seal had always been imperfect. Harlan pressed a handful of stiff repair paste into the gap. The wind outside pushed it back. He pressed harder, smoothed it flat, held a board against it until it firmed. East wall. Solid. The chimney side. Harlan held his breath and listened. The hairline crack near the chimney stones, the one Orrin had warned about, was making a sound. A thin, high whistle, barely audible over the wind and the stove's draw. Air was coming through. Not much. A needle-width gap. But the whistle meant the gap was there, and Orrin had said a needle gap at 30 below would open to a finger. Tobe sat wrapped in a blanket near the stove. His face was flushed. His cough had worsened over the past 2 days, and now his forehead was hot to the touch. "How's the wall?" Toby said. "Holding," Harlan said. "All of it?" Harlan did not answer. He looked at the chimney side crack and listened to it sing. The first hours proved the shell. Harlan tracked the night by the stove and the wind. He fed the fire once at midnight, 1 armload, carefully placed, and the temperature inside the cabin held steady, not warm, not comfortable, but livable. The kind of cold where a man could sit without shivering, where a boy with fever could sleep under 2 blankets and sweat instead of freeze. Outside, the wind did not relent. It pressed against the north wall with a steady force that Harlan could feel through the logs, not as air, not as draft, but as pressure. The tallow-ash shell was taking the wind the way a river stone takes current, absorbing the force, giving nothing back. The second hour brought the chimney side crack into focus. The whistle grew louder. Harlan held his candle near the crack, and the flame bent, not flat, not like the old days when wind poured through open seams, but enough. A steady deflection that meant cold air was entering and warm air was leaving. He needed to patch it, but the crack was 11 inches from the chimney stones, inside the fire break. Tallow paste this close to the chimney was the one thing Orrin had said would kill him. He looked at the crack. He looked at the chimney. He looked at the stove, which was drawing hard, the pipe radiating heat that shimmered the air above it. He mixed a small batch of repair paste, stiff, ash-heavy, almost chalky, and held it near the stove to warm. Not on the stove, near it, 3 inches away. The paste softened enough to work. He carried it to the crack, pressed it in with his thumb, smoothed it with the flat of his knife, and dusted it with dry ash. Then he held a board against the patch with one hand and a pan of cold ash against the board with the other, insulating the repair from the chimney's radiant heat. He held it for 10 minutes, counting his breaths, feeling the paste firm beneath the board. He pulled the board away. The patch held. The whistle stopped. Tobe slept. The 3rd hour brought Merritt Cale's oldest boy. The pounding on the door came sudden and hard. Not a knock, but a beating, the flat of a hand or a fist slamming the planks in a rhythm that was pure panic. Harlan pulled the door latch and the wind hit him full in the face, driving powder snow into the cabin in a white cloud that melted on the stove and hissed. Rory Cale was 14, tall for his age and thin the way all of Merritt's children were thin. His face was white, not pale white, the color of skin from which all blood is retreated. His hands were bare. His coat was unbuttoned. He had run 2 miles across open ground in a blizzard wearing no gloves and no hat. "Our wall opened," the boy said. His voice shook, not from cold, from something worse. "The west wall. The chinking came out in pieces. The wind, you can see through the wall. My mother put blankets over it and the wind tore them down." CTA 2. Harlan pulled the boy inside and shut the door. The heat that had leaked out during the 10 seconds the door was open was already noticeable. The interior temperature dropped, and Tobe stirred under his blankets and coughed. "Where's your father?" Harlan said. "He went to the line camp to get a help. He told me to bring the small ones here, but I couldn't carry them both and the baby." The boy's voice broke. He was 14 years old, and he had left his mother and 2 younger siblings in a cabin with a wall that was open to the blizzard because his father had told him to run for the only sealed building in the valley. Harlan looked at Toby. The boy was awake now, watching from his pallet, his fever-bright eyes tracking the snow melting on the floor. "Bank the stove," Harlan said to Tobe. "Full load. Close the damper to half." He wrapped Rory's hands in dry cloth. He made the boy sit near the stove and drink hot water from the kettle, not coffee, not broth, just heat in liquid form. Rory's fingers were red but not white at the tips. He would keep them. Harlan pulled on his coat, wrapped a wool scarf over his face, and opened the door. The wind hit him like a hand. Snow drove horizontal. He could not see the woodpile. He could not see the ground. He pulled the door shut behind him, leaned into the wind, and felt his way along the east wall to the wood stack. He carried 2 armloads inside. The heat loss from 2 door openings pressed the interior temperature down another degree. He sealed the door frame with a strip of tallow paste-smeared cloth pressed along the bottom gap. It was crude. It held. Inside the cabin, 4 people breathed. Harlan, Tobe, sick and burning with fever, Rory, shaking and terrified, and the stove, which Harlan fed one more time and then left to burn slow. The walls held. Through the rest of the night, the wind climbed. Harlan did not know the exact temperature because he did not own a thermometer, but he knew cold the way a man learns to know cold after 2 winters in Wyoming, the way iron burns bare skin, the way breath freezes before it falls, the way wood cracks like a gunshot when the temperature drops below a certain point. The cottonwoods cracked. Harlan heard them from inside the cabin, sharp reports like someone splitting rails with a maul, spaced at random intervals through the darkness. Trees exploded when the sap froze and expanded. Each crack meant the temperature had dropped further. Through the north wall, Harlan felt pressure. Through the east wall, pressure. Through the south and west, less. Those walls faced partially away from the north wind, but still the steady lean of a gale that had not paused since midnight. He held his candle at the chimney side patch. The flame stood straight. The repair held. He held the candle at the north wall. Straight. He held it at the south window frame where he had pressed repair paste hours ago. Straight. No snow dust along the seams. No frost forming on the interior walls. No draft bending a flame anywhere except at the door bottom, where the cloth strip was imperfect and a thin line of cold air crept along the floor. The stove did not roar. He did not need it to roar. The fire burned steady and moderate, and the heat it produced stayed inside the cabin because the cabin had stopped giving it away. Tobe sweated through his blankets. His fever was climbing, but the cabin was warm enough that sweating was possible, and sweating meant the fever was breaking rather than being buried under cold. Harlan soaked a cloth in water and pressed it to the boy's forehead, and the cloth stayed warm. At dawn, the wind had not stopped, but the snow thinned enough to see the yard. Harlan looked through the window, fogged with condensation on the inside, which was itself proof that the interior was warm enough to hold moisture, and saw a landscape that had changed. The ground was gone under 2 feet of powder with drifts 4 and 5 feet deep against the north-facing terrain. The woodpile was a white mound. The privy was buried to the door. He saw smoke from one neighbor's chimney, half a mile east, die and restart weekly. That meant the fire had nearly gone out, which meant the cabin had lost too much heat to maintain the draft, which meant the walls had failed. He saw another cabin's roof edge, a place where sod met log, shedding chunks of chinking that fell into the snow like dark teeth from a white jaw. Merritt Cale arrived after sunrise. He came across the flat the way a man walks who has stopped caring about dignity, stumbling, falling once, rising, stumbling again. His face was the same white as his son's had been. His hands were wrapped in strips of blanket. His left ear was the color of wax, and he did not seem to know it. Harlan pulled him inside. Merritt stood in the middle of the cabin, shaking, and the first thing he said was, "I can feel it." "Feel what?" Harlan said. "The heat," Merritt said. "Your cabin has heat." He looked at the walls. He looked at the stove, which was burning no harder than a man would burn it on an ordinary cold night. He looked at the pale, ash-dusted interior surface of the north wall, where no frost grew, where no draft moved, where the candle flame stood straight and still. "Abigail and the children are in the root cellar," Merritt said. "It's the only place out of the wind. The cabin lost the west wall chinking 2 hours after dark. I tried to pack blankets. The wind pulled them through the gaps." Rory stood and looked at his father and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The boy had seen his home lose its walls and his father leave for help and his mother carry babies into a hole in the ground. Harlan gave Merritt hot water and wrapped his ear in warm cloth. The ear would blister and peel, but Merritt would keep it. The hands were red, not black. "How many dead out there?" Harlan said. "No cattle everywhere," Merritt said. "Down in the draws, against the fence lines. I saw 20 head piled against a drift fence near the creek, frozen standing." He paused. "Deacon Marr went out yesterday afternoon to check the Rocking H's South Line shack. Nobody's seen him since." Harlan looked at the walls. He looked at Tobe. He looked at Merritt and Rory. 4 people in a 16 by 18-foot cabin with a stove that did not need to roar. The walls held. They found Deacon Marr 2 days later, after the wind dropped and the temperature rose to 5 above zero, which felt warm enough to walk. He was beside a drift fence half a mile from the line shack he had been trying to reach. He was not sitting up like Lem Party. He was face down in the snow, one arm stretched forward as if reaching for something. The snow around him was smooth. He had not struggled long. Harlan helped carry the body to the stage stop. He did not say what Mar had said about the cabin. He did not say anything about candles big enough for God to blow out. A dead man's jokes did not need an answer. Inside the cabin, during the worst hours, Harlan had stood with his hand against the north wall and felt nothing coming through. Not cold, not air, not wind. The logs were there behind the coating, and the coating was doing what he had built it to do, not insulating, not heating, not performing any miracle. Sealing, closing every path that moving air could find between the outside and the inside. The stove did the rest. A small fire in a sealed box keeps more heat than a large fire in a sieve. That was the whole secret. It was not clever. It was not beautiful. It was tallow and ash pressed into cracks by bloody hands. But it worked. And in the Powder River breaks in the winter of 1886, working was enough. The valley did not recover. It adjusted. There is a difference between the two that men who have not survived a killing winter do not understand. Recovery implies a return to what existed before. Adjustment means learning to stand on new ground and pretending the old ground was never there. Within a week of the wind dropping, the count began. Cattle dead against drift fences. Cattle dead in draws where they had sought shelter and found only deeper snow. Cattle dead standing, frozen upright, their legs locked in ice and their heads crusted white. The rocking H lost somewhere between 60 and 70% of its stock. Calvin Strake rode the range for 3 days and stopped counting because the numbers had passed the point where counting helped. Smaller outfits lost more. One man south of the breaks lost every head he owned and was last seen walking toward Buffalo with a bedroll and nothing else. Merritt Cale's family came out of the root cellar the morning the wind stopped. Abigail's face was gray. The 2 younger children did not cry. They had spent 19 hours underground in a space meant for storing potatoes and salt pork, huddled around a single candle that Abigail had kept burning by sheltering it with her body. The baby had a cough that would last 6 weeks. Harlan's cabin stood in the yard like an argument no one had asked for. The pale, ash-dusted shell was still intact. Drifted snow had piled against the north wall to the eave line, and where the snow touched the coating, it had not bonded. The grease surface shed moisture, and the drift leaned against the wall without gripping it. Harlan swept it away with a board, and the coating beneath was unmarked. Men came to look. They came singly at first. A cowboy from the Rocking H who had heard the cabin held heat. A freighter passing through who had sheltered at the stage stop and heard the story secondhand. A woman named Della Grieve, whose husband had died of pneumonia 2 winters before, and who now ran their small holding alone with a 14-year-old son. They came, and they touched the wall. Every one of them did the same thing, reached out and pressed a palm flat against the surface, held it there, and then looked at their hand. The grease, the grit, the smoothness. They touched it the way people touch something they have heard about, but do not yet believe. A wall that shed wind and water and kept heat. A wall made of things that every household in the valley already possessed and no one had thought to combine. Calvin Strake came on the 4th day after the storm. He did not touch the wall. He walked the perimeter slowly, hands behind his back, the way he had walked it the first time. But this time he stopped at each wall and stood close, tilting his head slightly, listening. Then he crouched at the base of the north wall and put his face near the foundation seam and held still for 10 seconds. He stood. He brushed his knees. He looked at Harlan. "I told you 6 cords because I was counting on the wind taking half your fire," Strake said. "You stopped the wind. That changes the count." Harlan waited. There was more coming, and he could hear it gathering behind Strake's teeth the way weather gathers behind a ridge. "It's ugly," Strake said. "It stinks in a warm spell. Dogs will chew it. Sun will soften it. I would not put it on a building I expected to last 10 years. He paused. "But you did not need it to last 10 years. You needed it to last one winter, and it lasted the worst night I have seen in 25 years of wintering stock in this territory. So I will say what's true. You solved the right problem. The problem was not firewood. The problem was wind." He extended his hand. Harlan shook it. Strake's grip was dry, hard, and brief, the handshake of a man who did not shake hands often and did not believe the gesture needed to last. Strake left. He did not offer to help spread the method. He did not ask for the recipe. He was a cattleman, and his world had just lost most of its cattle, and sealing cabin walls was not his problem. But his admission was worth more than help. Calvin Strake's word carried weight in the valley the way water carries weight in a bucket, invisibly until you try to lift it. Merritt Cale came the next day. He did not come to look. He came to learn. He stood in Harlan's yard with his wrapped hands and his peeling ear and said, "Show me." Harlan showed him. He walked Merritt through the process the way Orrin had walked him through it, not lecturing, not explaining theory, but doing. He rendered a small batch of tallow in the kettle while Merritt watched. He sifted ash through doubled flour sack while Merritt held the frame. He mixed the paste to the right consistency, thick enough to hold ridges on the paddle, stiff enough that it did not run when pressed against a vertical surface, and he applied a test patch to a board while Merritt crouched beside him and studied the motion of his hands. 2 parts ash to 1 part fat, Harlan said. "That's the starting ratio. Adjust until it feels right. More ash makes it harder but more brittle. More fat makes it flexible but softer. You want it stiff enough that you can press your thumb into it and it holds the print without cracking." "How thick?" Merritt said. "Half an inch over the seams, thinner on the log faces, thicker under the eaves and around the corners where wind hits hardest." The fire break. 18 inches from the chimney, 18 from the stovepipe. Inside that line you use stone and mud and nothing else. This is the rule that will kill you if you break it. Merritt nodded. He did not write anything down because men in the Powder River breaks did not carry pencils. He committed the numbers to the same place he kept cattle counts and feed calculations and the dates his children were born, the hard ledger of memory that frontier men maintained because paper was expensive and brains were free. "My west wall is gone," Merritt said. "Chinking came out in sheets. I can see daylight through half the logs." "Start with the worst seams," Harlan said. "Don't try to coat the whole wall at once. Seal the cracks first. Let the base layer harden. Then add the weather face." Merritt took a bucket of pre-mixed paste with him when he left. Harlan did not charge for it. He did not frame it as charity. He said, "Bring the bucket back and tell me what worked and what didn't." 3 days later, Merritt returned the bucket and said the north wall seams were sealed, and his cabin had held heat through the night for the first time since the storm. His wife, Abigail, had slept without waking to feed the fire. The baby's cough had eased. "The south wall is next," Merritt said. "I need more ash." "I'll show you how to sift it," Harlan said. Della Grieve came on a Tuesday, leading her son by the arm because the boy had slipped on ice and twisted his ankle and could not walk without support. She did not ask for help with the ankle. She asked for help with her cabin. "My north wall sounds like a flute," she said. "Every gap whistles a different note. I've been stuffing rags into the cracks since November, and the wind pulls them through like thread." Harlan and Tobe, whose fever had broken 3 days after the storm, and who was now pale, thin, and restless, walked to Della's place 2 miles east. Her cabin was smaller than Harlan's 12 by 14, built from the same cottonwood and cursed with the same cut-bank clay. The chinking had failed in the same pattern: cracks along the seams, gaps at the corners, daylight between the logs. Harlan taught Della the way Orrin had taught him. He showed her how to render fat she already had. She kept 2 milk goats and had saved the slaughter fat from a hog she had butchered in October. He showed her how to sift ash. He showed her how to warm the seam with a pan of coals before applying paste. He warned her about the fire break. He said it 3 times because Della's cabin had a stovepipe that exited through the wall rather than the roof, and the clearance between the pipe and the nearest log was barely 10 inches. "Nothing within 18 inches, Harlan said. "I know your pipe is closer than that. Use stone and mud around the pipe. Pack it thick. If the grease touches that pipe during a hard burn, you lose the cabin and everything inside it." Della nodded. She was a woman who had run a homestead alone for 2 winters. She did not need to be told twice about fire. Her son, Ellis, mixed the first batch of paste while sitting on a stool with his bad ankle propped on a bucket. He stirred with the same steady rhythm that Toby had learned from Orrin, and Harlan watched the boy work and saw the same thing Orrin had seen in Harlan: a person who tested before boasting, who watched the material and let it tell him when the mixture was right. Word spread the way everything spread in open country, unevenly, distorted, and attached to opinions. 2 ranch wives rode to Harlan's cabin together, sent by their husbands who were too proud to come themselves. They asked about purifying tallow, and Harlan showed them. They asked about the ratio, and he gave them the numbers. They asked about the fire break, and he repeated the rule. They left with a bucket of paste each, and a list of warnings that Harlan made them repeat back to him before they mounted. A man from 20 miles north sent word through the stage stop that he wanted to know how to grease a chicken coop. Harlan sent back word that the method worked on any structure with log walls and seams, but that a chicken coop full of birds would generate enough moisture to soften the interior coating, unless the builder left ventilation gaps at the ridge. A woman whose husband had broken his leg in 3 places asked Merritt to coat her cabin. Merritt did it in 2 days, working with his oldest daughter. He charged nothing. He said the same thing Harlan had said: "Bring the bucket back and tell me what worked." The method was spreading, not because it was elegant, not because it was beautiful, because it was possible. Every household in the valley had access to animal fat and wood ash. Every household had seams that leaked. The gap between the problem and the solution was knowledge, and Harlan was giving the knowledge away. Jory Tull watched this happen and understood exactly what it meant. A storekeeper's power in frontier country rested on 2 things: supply and debt. He controlled what people could buy, and he controlled what people owed. A method that used materials people already had, that solved a problem people would otherwise have to buy their way out of, that spread from cabin to cabin through labor and teaching rather than through purchase. That method was a threat to the entire structure that kept Jory Tull necessary. He did not attack the method directly. He was too smart for that. The valley had just watched the method work through the worst night in memory. Saying it was foolish would make Tull look foolish. Instead, he attacked the edges. He told Calvin Strake that any cabin coated in tallow should be condemned as a fire hazard. Strake listened and said he would support that judgment when Tull produced evidence of a fire caused by the coating. Tull had no evidence. No cabin had burned. The fire break held. He told the man at the stage stop that Harlan was spreading a technique that would ruin property values because no buyer would purchase a cabin that smelled like a rendering pit. The man at the stage stop did not own property and did not care. He raised the price of tallow at his store. Not by much, from 3 cents a pound to 5, but enough that people who had been selling their excess fat to Tull for candle stock now had to decide whether to sell for a profit or keep it for their walls. And he began buying every bucket of cheap tallow that came through the county: ranch scrap, slaughter waste, The rancid trim that nobody wanted, Tull bought it all. He did not use it. He stored it in barrels behind his store. The purpose was not to coat his own building. The purpose was to make the material harder for others to get. Harlan heard about the buying from Merritt, who heard it from the freighter, who heard it from the ranch cook who had sold Harlan the 2 buckets of beef tallow before the storm. He's buying fat, Merritt said, every pound he can find. He can't buy all of it, Harlan said. Every man who traps an animal or butchers a hog has fat. He can't buy what people render in their own yards. He can make it expensive enough that people think twice about using it on a wall instead of selling it for cash. This was true. And it was the kind of fight that a storekeeper always won because a storekeeper controlled the ledger and a trapper controlled nothing but his own hands. Orrin Quill did not live to see the full spread. His lungs had been failing before the storm. The years of soap smoke and lye vapor and rendering fumes had built something in his chest that no amount of rest could dissolve. He coughed in the mornings, a deep, wet sound that came from below the ribs, and he coughed at night, and between the coughing he breathed with a care that suggested breathing had become work rather than reflex. He stayed at Harlan's cabin through December and into January. He slept on a pallet near the west wall, which he said was the warmest spot in the cabin because the west wall caught afternoon sun and released it slowly through the coating after dark. Whether this was true or whether Orrin simply preferred to sleep near the wall he had helped seal, Harlan did not ask. They worked together through the short winter days. Orrin helped Harlan develop improvements to the original formula, refinements born from testing, failure, and the kind of meticulous observation that Orrin brought to everything. The first improvement was a 3-layer system. The base layer, packed deep into the crack, pushed with fingers and a flat stick until every gap was filled, was heavy with fat and light on ash, because flexibility mattered more than hardness in the core where wood expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The weather layer, the visible exterior face, was heavy with ash and light on fat because hardness and water resistance mattered more on the surface. Between the two, a thin middle coat of balanced ratio bonded the layers. The second improvement was a summer rule: thinner coating on south-facing walls, more ash in the mixture, and a dusting of clay on the surface to reflect heat. South walls that had sagged during the pre-storm thaw would sag again when spring came. If the coating was thinner and stiffer, it would flex without sliding. The third was a chimney exclusion zone formalized with measurements. Orrin drew it on Harlan's wall with charcoal. A rectangle around the chimney stones, 18 inches on each side and 12 inches above, marked as clearly as a property line. Inside the rectangle, stone, mud, lime if available, nothing else. Outside, tallow-ash paste. The line between safety and fire was a charcoal mark on a log, and Orrin made Harlan trace it every time he showed the method to someone new. The fourth was a rodent deterrent. The lower 2 feet of exterior coating, the zone where dogs, coyotes, and mice could reach, received extra ash and a heavy dusting of clay from the cut bank. The clay cut the animal smell. The extra ash made the surface harder and less rewarding to chew. It was not perfect. Dogs still scratched at it, but they did not gouge it the way they had gouged the early patches. The fifth was a repair kit. Small cakes of hardened ash tallow, each the size of a man's palm, wrapped in cloth and stored near the stove where they could be softened quickly if a crack opened during a storm. Orrin pressed 6 of them and stacked them on a shelf beside the flour. "Emergency patches," he said. "Warm one in your hands, press it into the crack. Hold it until it skins. 5 minutes. You should be able to seal a failing seam before the heat loss gets critical." This was the lesson of the chimney side crack during the storm, the near failure that almost became the only failure. Orrin had not been present for it, but Harlan had told him every detail, and Orrin had listened the way a surgeon listens to a description of a wound he did not treat. He asked about the distance from the chimney. He asked about the temperature of the paste when applied. He asked about the dust layer. He asked about the board and the ash insulation. "You did it right," Orrin said. "But you almost did it wrong. 11 inches from the chimney. The rule says 18. You went inside the line because you had no choice. If the stove had been burning harder, if the chimney stones had been hotter, the patch would have softened instead of setting. You would have had a grease fire on your chimney wall with a sick boy and 2 strangers in the cabin." "I know," Harlan said. "The repair kit means you never have to go inside the line again. Warm the cake. Carry it to the crack. Apply it at the edge of the exclusion zone. Push it toward the chimney, but do not cross the mark." Harlan nodded. He looked at the charcoal line on the wall and memorized the distance the way a man memorizes the depth of a river crossing, the number that keeps you alive only if you respect it. Orrin's cough worsened in February. The sound changed from a wet rattle to something deeper, as if the air had to navigate obstacles to reach the bottom of his lungs. He worked shorter days. He sat more. He still sifted ash with 3 fingers on his left hand and 5 on his right, and he still corrected Harlan's technique with the same flat, certain voice. But the pauses between his sentences grew longer, as the air he needed to speak became harder to find. They built a repair wall together, a test section behind the cabin where Harlan could try new ratios, and Orrin could watch the results without walking to someone else's homestead. The test wall was 4 feet wide, 7 feet tall, made of 2 cottonwood logs stacked and chinked with nothing. Harlan applied different mixtures to different sections. More ash, less ash, clay added, clay omitted, single layer, triple layer, thin, thick. Orrin scored each section with a knife after 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, testing hardness and adhesion and water resistance. "Don't let them turn a test into a gospel," Orrin said one afternoon, sitting on a stump near the test wall with his coat pulled tight and his breathing audible from 10 feet away. "You found something that works. That does not mean it works everywhere. It does not mean it works on every kind of log. It does not mean it replaces lime when lime is available. Watch what it does. Keep watching. The day you stop watching is the day someone copies you wrong and burns their house down." Harlan said, "I'll keep watching." "You will," Orrin said, "because you tested the scrap before you committed the skin. That's why I walked 2 miles in the cold." He died in early March, after the worst of the winter had passed, but before the thaw. The morning was cold, but not bitter. Toby had fed the stove at dawn. Harlan woke and saw Orrin sitting in the chair near the west wall, his hands in his lap, his coat buttoned to the chin. His eyes were closed. His face was still. Harlan touched his shoulder. Orrin did not stir. The stove crackled. Outside, a magpie called from the cottonwoods along the creek. The west wall was warm from the banked fire and the night's residual heat, and the air in the cabin was still and quiet in a way that had once been impossible and was now ordinary. Orrin Quill had spent his last winter warm. That was not a small thing. A man who had lost 2 fingers to cold, who had hauled boiling kettles and blizzards, who had lived most of his life inside the kind of work that broke bodies and rewarded nothing. That man had died in a sealed cabin, warm, beside a wall he had helped build, in a chair he had pulled close to the wood because the wood still held heat from the night before. Harlan buried him on the rise south of the cabin, 50 yards from May's cairn. He dug the grave himself because the ground was frozen and Tobe was still recovering, and because there are things a man does not ask for help with. It took a day and a half. The pick rang against the frozen dirt like a bell. He did not mark the grave with a board. He marked it with a stone, flat and heavy, carried from the creek. He set it at the head and did not carve a name because he did not own a chisel and because Orrin would not have wanted the work spent. CTA 3. The spring sleet came in late March, a storm that was not a blizzard but something colder in its way, a hard rain that turned to ice on every surface it touched. The temperature hovered at 32 degrees, exactly the line where water decides whether to be itself or something harder, and the rain fell and froze and fell and froze until every post, every rail, every branch, and every cabin wall was glazed. This tested the coating differently. Not wind, not cold, water. Harlan's cabin shed the ice. The tallow-ash surface did not absorb water. That was its original virtue, the thing his mother had known when she sealed his boot. And the ice that formed on the exterior surface did not bond to the grease. It sat on top like a shell, and when the sun warmed the south wall on the second day, the ice slid off in sheets that shattered on the frozen ground. But a cabin 2 miles north, coated by a man named Givens, who had watched Harlan work and tried to copy the method without asking for guidance, did not fare as well. Givens had used too much fat and not enough ash. His coating was soft, greasy, and poorly cured. The sleet soaked into the surface rather than beading on it. Moisture crept behind the fat layer into the log seams and froze there. When the ice expanded, it pushed the coating away from the logs in blisters that cracked and fell. Within 2 days, half of Givens's north wall was bare again, and the moisture trapped behind the remaining coating had begun to rot the wood. It stank. Even in cold air, the combination of rancid fat and wet rot produced a smell that carried 50 yards. Jory Tull arrived at Givens's cabin before Harlan did. He brought 2 men and stood in the yard with his arms folded and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has been proven right. "This is what happens," Tull said to anyone within earshot. "Grease walls, rot, ruin. The man who taught this should be held to account for the damage." Harlan heard about Tull's visit from Merritt. He did not wait. He walked to Givens's cabin that afternoon. The damage was real. Harlan could see it and smell it, and he did not pretend otherwise. The north wall was failing. The coating was wrong, too soft, too thick, poorly cured, applied over frost without preparation. Every mistake Orrin had warned about was present in one wall. Givens stood in his yard with the look of a man who has tried to fix something and made it worse. He was not angry at Harlan. He was angry at himself, which was harder. Harlan inspected the wall. He pulled a section of failed coating away from the logs and looked at the wood beneath. 2 logs showed dark, wet staining where moisture had been trapped. The rest were dry. "The 2 wet logs need to dry before you recoat," Harlan said. "Leave them open. Let air get to them. If you seal over wet wood, the rot continues under the paste and you lose the log." "Tull says the whole method is dangerous," Givens said. Harlan looked at the wall. He looked at Givens. He said the thing that Orrin's last lesson required him to say, the thing that was harder than defending the method and more important than winning the argument. "Tull is right about this wall," Harlan said. "This wall was done wrong. Too much fat, not enough ash, applied too thick over frost. Every one of those mistakes is mine to own because I should have taught you before you tried it alone." Givens stared at him. "The method works when it's done right," Harlan said. "This wall was not done right. That's not the method's fault, and it's not your fault. It's a failure of teaching, and I'm standing here to fix it." He spent the next 2 days at Givens's cabin. He stripped the failed coating from the north wall. He let the wet logs air dry as much as the cold allowed. He mixed a new batch, proper ratio, properly sifted ash, properly purified tallow, and recoated the wall in 2 layers with Givens working beside him, learning the technique the way Harlan had learned it from Orrin, through hands, not words. When he finished, he told Givens the same warnings he told everyone: fire break, summer thinning, ash dusting, rodent deterrent, ventilation at the ridge. And the rule beneath all the rules: watch what it does. If something looks wrong, strip it and redo it. A bad patch left in place becomes a failure waiting for the next storm. Toll heard about Harlan's admission at Givens's place. He repeated it at the store, framing it as a confession of failure. But the men who heard it did not hear failure. They heard a man who looked at a bad result and told the truth about it instead of blaming the weather or the material or the person who had done the work. In country where men routinely lied about the number of cattle they had lost and the amount of debt they carried, honest admission was strange enough to be memorable. Merritt said it plainest. Toll told us the grease walls were dangerous. Voss told us the same thing, but he also told us how to do it right. I know which one I'd trust to fix my cabin. Toll's campaign did not end with Givens's wall. It escalated. In early April, Harlan found tracks around his cabin that were not animal tracks. Boot prints in the mud near the east wall, close to the base where the coating met the foundation stones. The prints were fresh, made within the past night, and they led away toward the road. 2 days later, Tobe woke before dawn and found a dark smear along the lower 18 inches of the east wall. The smear was thick, greasy, and reeked. Harlan touched it. Spoiled grease. Beef tallow that had gone rancid past the point of use, the kind of fat that attracted every carnivore within a mile. Someone had smeared rotten grease along the base of Harlan's cabin in the dark. Tobe found the boot prints again. The right boot had a gouge in the heel, a distinctive mark, the kind of thing a boy notices because boys look at the ground more than men do. Toby had seen that boot print before. He had seen it at Toll's store, made by a man named Rafe Marr, Deacon Marr's cousin, recently arrived from Montana, recently hired by Toll to stock shelves and haul freight. It was Rafe Marr, Toby said. Harlan looked at the smeared grease. He looked at the boot prints. He looked at Toby, who was 13 now and had the set jaw of a boy who had survived a winter that killed grown men and did not find the world amusing. "We can't prove it was Rafe," Harlan said. "We can't prove Toll sent him, and even if we could, there's no sheriff within 38 miles and no judge within 60. So he gets away with it." "He gets away with it today," Harlan said. "We cleaned the wall today." They scrubbed the rotten grease from the base of the east wall with hot water and ash soap, one of Orrin's formulas, still stacked in small cakes near the stove. They recoated the cleaned section with fresh paste, heavily dusted with clay to mask any remaining animal smell. Harlan added an extra measure of ash at the base and packed it smooth. That night, he sat in the dark with the door open an inch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the east wall. Nothing came. Not that night, not the next. But the fight had changed shape. It was no longer about whether the method worked. It was about whether a storekeeper who controlled the valley's debts could destroy a man who had made himself useful without the storekeeper's permission. The second winter was quieter than the first, but not easier. The range had been devastated. Cattle that survived the storm were thin, and many were lost to spring diseases. Ranch outfits that had employed 20 men now employed 6. Money tightened. Debt deepened. Jory Toll's store became more essential, not less, because credit was the only currency half the valley had. But the cabins were better. Harlan and Merritt held a workday at the Grieve place in October of 1887. Della had rendered a winter's worth of goat and hog fat. Her son Ellis had sifted 30 pounds of ash. They needed guidance on the chimney exclusion zone because Della's stovepipe exit had been moved during the summer, pushed 4 inches further from the wall, which gave barely enough clearance for the fire break. Harlan measured the distance. 14 inches from pipe to nearest log. The rules said 18. It's not enough, Harlan said. It's what I have, Della said. Then we pack stone and mud for the full 14 inches and extend the exclusion zone 6 inches past the pipe on every side. No paste within 20 inches of the pipe. We lose some coverage on the chimney wall, but we keep the building standing. Della agreed. She did not argue or complain about the extra work. She measured the exclusion zone herself with a knotted string, the way Harlan had measured his own, and she marked the line with charcoal and would not let Ellis apply paste inside it. Merritt coated his own barn, the half-finished structure that had been open to the wind since he built it. He used a thin coat, more ash than fat, because the barn held animals whose body heat and moisture would interact with the coating differently than a stove-heated cabin. Harlan warned him about ventilation. A sealed barn with cattle inside would trap moisture that could rot both the coating and the wood. Merritt left gaps at the ridgeline and at the south eave, enough for air to move without letting wind in. By the second winter, Harlan had helped seal 8 cabins, 2 line shacks, and 1 lambing shed. Not all used pure tallow-ash paste. Some mixed in lime where lime was available. Some used a combination of clay core with tallow-ash weatherface. Some applied the coating only to the north and west walls, the wind-facing exposures, and left the south and east walls conventionally chinked. Every one of them received the warnings: fire break, summer rule, rodent deterrent, ventilation, and Orrin's final lesson, which Harlan repeated so often it became a kind of creed. Watch what it does. Don't let a test become a gospel. Tull's own failure came in November of that second winter. He had been watching. That was the thing about Jory Tull. He watched everything, and he absorbed information the way a sponge absorbs water without appearing to change shape. He had watched Harlan coat cabins. He had watched Merritt coat his barn. He had heard the ratios repeated at his own store by men who did not know he was listening, and he had decided that if the method worked, he should control it, not by learning to do it properly, but by doing it cheaply. He coated his storehouse, a 20 by 30-foot log building where he kept dry goods, hardware, and the barrels of purchased tallow that he had been hoarding. He did it at night with Rafe Marr and one other man, using the tallow he had stockpiled. He did not sift the ash. He did not purify the fat. He applied the paste thick and fast, covering the walls in a single night. And he did not observe the fire break. The storehouse had a sheet iron stove in the back corner, used to keep the temperature above freezing so that canned goods and bottled medicines would not burst. The stovepipe exited through the wall 6 inches from a log. Tull coated to within 4 inches of the pipe. The stove was burning hard on a cold night in late November when the tallow-ash paste nearest the pipe began to soften. The fat liquefied first, running down the wall in thin lines that caught light. Then the surface began to smoke. Not flame, smoke, gray and acrid, filling the storehouse from the ceiling down. Tull smelled it from the store. He ran to the storehouse, opened the door, and the rush of fresh air fed the smoldering surface. A line of flame appeared along the paste nearest the pipe, low, blue, almost invisible, but growing. He dragged goods into the street: barrels, crates, sacks of flour and beans. Rafe Marr helped. A cowboy passing on the road stopped and carried ammunition boxes from the back. They saved most of the stock. They did not save the storehouse wall. The fire break section burned through the coating and scorched the log beneath, leaving a black wound 3 feet wide and floor to ceiling. The rest of the storehouse was undamaged. Only the section near the pipe had failed. Calvin Strake saw the damage the next morning. He had ridden in to buy tobacco and found Tull standing in the street beside his salvaged goods with the expression of a man who has been insulted by his own ambition. Strake looked at the burned section. He looked at the unburned sections. He looked at the distance between the stovepipe and the scorched log. Voss taught a seal, Strake said. You sold a shortcut. Toll said nothing. There was nothing to say. The exclusion zone, the single rule that Harlan repeated more than any other, the rule that Orrin had said mattered more than all the others combined, had been the rule that Toll broke. The storehouse fire did more damage to Toll than the loss of one wall. It proved, in front of the valley, that the method was dangerous only when the warnings were ignored, and that the man who had been loudest about the danger was the man who had been most careless with it. Within a week, Toll released the extension on Harlan's cabin note. He did not do this from generosity. He did it because half the valley now owed Harlan goodwill for sealed cabins, and holding paper over a man that many people respected was costing Toll more in social capital than the $41 was worth. Harlan did not thank him. He paid the next installment, $3, scraped from winter pelts, and walked out of the store without comment. Lena Harrow arrived in the Powder River Breaks in the spring of 1888, not because she had chosen the place, but because the place was what she could afford after the boarding house in Buffalo, where she had been washing and mending clothes for 2 years, raised its rent past what a widow with no children and no family could pay. She rented a room at the stage stop, the same room Orrin Quill had kept before his death, and she paid for it the same way. Labor. She washed. She mended. She boiled. She ironed shirts with a flat iron heated on the stage stop stove, pressing the wrinkles from cotton and wool with the same deliberate, repetitive motion that she applied to everything. She was 32 years old. Her husband, a teamster named George Harrow, had died when his wagon overturned on the Bozeman Road 3 years prior. She had no family in the territory and no family elsewhere that would claim her. Harlan met her because of ash. He had come to the stage stop in April to trade pelts and collect the ash that the stage stop cook saved for him in a barrel beside the kitchen door. The cook saved it because Harlan had sealed 3 seams in the stage stop's main room the previous winter, and the cook had stopped waking at 4 in the morning to feed the fire. Ash was payment. It was the cheapest and most honest currency in the valley. Lena was sorting the ash when Harlan arrived. She had pulled the barrel into the yard and was sifting the contents through a piece of muslin, not flour sack muslin, which was finer, into a basin set on a flat stone. The powder that fell through was cleaner and finer than anything Harlan had seen outside of Orrin's work. He stopped. He watched her hands. She sifted the way a woman who had spent years handling lye and soap and bleach sifts, steadily, with a rhythm that suggested the motion was as natural as breathing. She did not look up. "That's muslin," Harlan said. "It is," Lena said. "Flour sack is coarser. You're getting finer ash." "I know what I'm getting." She still did not look up. "The cook said you use this for wall paste. I wanted to see what your material looked like before you processed it." "Why?" She looked up then. Her face was narrow, tanned from outdoor work, and her eyes had the particular sharpness of a person who had been solving problems without help for long enough that she no longer expected help to arrive. "Because I wash clothes for a living," she said. "I boil lye every week. I render soap twice a month. I handle more fat and ash in a season than most men in this valley handle in 5 years. And I have a room at the stage stop with walls that whistle every time the wind blows. And I would like to know if the method everyone is talking about is as good as they say, or as dangerous as the storekeeper claims." Harlan looked at the basin of sifted ash. It was better than his. The muslin caught finer particles than flour sack, and the resulting powder was smoother, more uniform, the kind of material that would mix into tallow without lumps or air pockets. "It's both," Harlan said. "It works, and it's dangerous. The same way a stove works and is dangerous." "Show me," Lena said. He showed her. Not at the stage stop. The stage stop walls were already partially sealed, and the owner did not want the smell of rendering in the main room. He took her to his cabin, 2 hours' walk, and showed her the walls, the test section behind the cabin, the repair kit on the shelf, the charcoal marks around the chimney that defined the exclusion zone. Lena touched the walls the way everyone did, palm flat, held for 5 seconds, then pulled away to examine the grease on her hand. But she did something no one else had done. She smelled it. She brought her fingers to her nose and inhaled slowly, the way a soap maker smells a batch to judge whether the lye has fully saponified. "Your fat's not fully rendered," she said. "There's still protein in it. That's what the dogs smell." Harlan stared at her. He had assumed the dog problem was about the fat itself, the animal origin, the greasy surface. It had not occurred to him that the issue was incomplete, rendering leaving organic material that would decompose and attract scavengers. "How do you fix that?" he said. "2 boils instead of 1. First boil renders the fat. Second boil with clean water purifies it. You lift the cake, scrape the bottom. I assume you do that already." "Oren taught me that." "Then you boil the scraped cake again with fresh water. The second boil pulls the remaining protein. The fat cake you get is paler, harder, and nearly odorless when cooled. It's what we use for fine soap. Rough soap uses first boil fat. Fine soap uses second boil." Harlan processed this. 2 boils meant more water, more fuel, more time. But it also meant a coating that did not attract every carnivore in the valley. "What about the repair cakes?" he said. He showed her the shelf where Oren's wrapped palm-sized cakes of emergency paste sat in a row. Lena picked one up, unwrapped it, and examined the surface. "These will go rancid within 6 months," she said. "The cloth traps moisture against the surface. You need muslin sleeves dusted with clay inside. The clay absorbs moisture. The muslin breathes. The cake stays dry." She rewrapped the cake in muslin she carried in her mending kit, dusted the inside of the wrap with fine clay from the basin she had brought, and pressed it closed. The difference was visible immediately. The muslin sat looser than the cloth, and the clay dusting gave the package a dry, powdery feel instead of the greasy tackiness of the original wrapping. "You know this because of laundry," Harlan said. It was not a question. "I know this because laundry is chemistry done by hand," Lena said. "Fat, ash, lye, water, heat, timing. The only difference between what you're doing on these walls and what I do in a wash kettle is scale." Their partnership began through work. It continued through argument. They disagreed about ratios. Lena thought Harlan's standard mix, 2 parts ash to 1 part fat, was too lean for exterior surfaces that faced heavy rain. She wanted more fat in the weather layer to improve water shedding. Harlan countered that more fat meant softer curing and the slumping problem on south walls that he and Oren had already solved by going the other direction. They tested both. On the repair wall behind the cabin, they applied Lena's richer mix to one section and Harlan's leaner mix to the adjacent section. After 2 weeks, Lena's section shed water better, but showed a slight softness at the surface during a warm afternoon. Harlan's section was harder, but developed hairline cracks where rain had soaked into the ash and expanded during a freeze. Neither was right. Neither was wrong. The answer, which they arrived at through 3 more weeks of testing, was a compromise that Oren would have approved. Lena's richer mix for the weather face on north and west walls where sun exposure was minimal. Harlan's leaner mix for south and east walls where solar softening was the primary risk. The repair wall became a map of their collaboration, different sections marked with charcoal notations in 2 different hands. Tobe watched them work. He was 13 now, taller than he had been during the storm, still thin, but with the kind of wiriness that suggested the thinness was becoming permanent rather than temporary. He had Oren's sifting rhythm and Harlan's habit of testing before speaking, and increasingly his own opinions about things. "She's right about the muslin," Toby said one evening after Lena had gone back to the stage stop. "The cloth wraps are greasy by spring. The muslin ones stay dry." "I know she's right about the muslin," Harlan said. "Then tell her." "I did." "You said the muslin was fine. That's not the same as saying she was right." Harlan looked at the boy. Toby looked back. There was a quality in the boy's expression that had not been there before the storm, a directness, a willingness to say what he saw without cushioning it. The winter had burned away the deference that children in hard country learn to wear like armor. "She was right," Harlan said. "Tell her that," Tobe said. Harlan did, the next time Lena came to the cabin. He said it plainly. The muslin wraps were better, the double-boil rendering was better, and the clay dusting cut the animal's smell in a way that his ash dusting alone had not. Lena listened, nodded, and said, "Now show me the chimney exclusion zone, because the stage stop's pipe exits through a wall, and the clearance is 8 inches, and I need to know how to handle it." He showed her. She measured. She calculated. She decided that 8 inches was not enough for tallow-ash paste at any ratio, and that the stage stop's chimney wall would have to remain conventionally chinked with clay and hair mortar packed as tight as possible, while the remaining 3 walls received the full treatment. This was the kind of decision that Orrin had made instinctively, the judgment call between coverage and safety that separated the method from the gospel. Lena made it without asking for permission, and without asking Harlan to make it for her. She looked at the pipe, measured the distance, applied the rule, and decided. Harlan watched her do it, and understood that he was not teaching her. He was working beside someone who had arrived with half the knowledge already in place, and needed only the other half to see the full picture. The courtship, if it could be called that, was conducted in paste and argument, and the particular silence that falls between 2 people who have finished working and have not yet decided what to say. They sealed the stage stop's 3 eligible walls in May. The owner watched from a chair and said nothing useful. Toby helped. Lena mixed while Harlan applied. Then Harlan mixed while Lena applied, and they discovered that Lena's application was smoother than Harlan's because her hands were accustomed to the even pressure of ironing, and she spread the paste the way she pressed a shirt, flat, steady strokes that left no ridges. They sat on the stage stop's porch afterward, drinking coffee that the cook had made too strong, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The sun was low. The Powder River breaks stretched east in a rumpled line of brown and gray-green, and the sky above them was the kind of pale blue that Wyoming produces in spring when the wind stops and the air forgets to be cruel. "Your hands are worse than mine," Lena said. Harlan looked at his hands. The cracks from ash lye had healed during the summer, but left scars, white lines across his knuckles and between his fingers that would not tan. His nails were stained dark from years of handling fat and charcoal and dirt. "Yours aren't good," he said. She held up her hands. The skin was red and rough from lye and hot water. Her fingertips were smooth, not soft, smooth, the way skin becomes when it has been boiled and scrubbed so many times that the ridges wear down. "Laundry hands," she said. "They don't heal. They just stop hurting." This was the moment. Not a kiss, not a declaration, not a scene from a novel. 2 people with ruined hands sitting on a porch after a day of work, looking at the damage and recognizing it in each other. The recognition was not romantic. It was structural. They understood each other's costs because they had paid similar ones. Toby, who had been sitting on the step below them, stood and went inside without being asked. He was 13 years old, and he understood something about adults that adults often did not understand about themselves, that some conversations needed to happen in silence, and that the silence could only work if no one was watching. Harlan married Lena in the autumn of 1888. The ceremony was at the stage stop, performed by a circuit preacher who passed through Johnson County twice a year and who charged 50 cents in a meal. Merritt Cale stood witness. Abigail Cale brought a pie. Tobe wore a clean shirt and stood straight and did not smile, but his eyes were steady, which was his version of smiling. They did not move. Lena came to the cabin. Her mending work continued. She carried laundry between the stage stop and the cabin twice a week, a 4-hour walk each way, until Harlan built a mending bench inside the cabin, and Lena's clients learned to bring their work to her there. The cabin smelled perpetually of soap and tallow and ash. Visitors said it smelled like a chandler's workshop. Lena said it smelled like work, which was the only smell she had never minded. By the third winter, Harlan and Lena had helped seal 8 cabins, 2 line shacks, 1 lambing shed, and the stage stop. They did not charge for labor. They sometimes received payment in materials, fat, ash, cloth, and sometimes in barter. A sack of flour from Delagrive, a repaired bridle from Merritt, a quarter of elk from a hunter whose cabin Harlan had sealed in October. They were not rich, they were necessary. The difference between the two was everything in country like this. A rich man could leave when the land turned hostile. A necessary man was bound to the place by the same bonds that bound the place to him. Families stocked ash barrels the way they had once stocked only flour and salt. The barrel beside the hearth or the stove became standard in the cabins along the breaks, not because anyone decreed it, but because the lesson of the first winter had settled into the valley's memory the way silt settles into a riverbed, slowly, permanently, invisible until you dug down and found it. Men who had laughed at grease walls no longer laughed. They did not celebrate the method either. They used it. They applied it to the north-facing seams where the wind hit hardest. They taught their sons to sift ash fine. They kept repair cakes on a shelf near the stove, wrapped in muslin and dusted with clay. And they checked the chimney exclusion zone every autumn the way they checked their trap lines and their wood stacks. Calvin Strake recommended the method, formally by name, to any smallholder who asked, but only for poor clay districts where proper lime chinking was not available or not affordable. He said this in front of Jory Tull at Tull's own store, standing at the counter where he was buying tobacco. "It is not a replacement for lime," Strake said. "It is a replacement for dyeing because you cannot afford lime." Tull said nothing. He weighed the tobacco. He took Strake's money. He did not look up. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed, and the work has become routine, and the extraordinary has settled into the ordinary. Harlan trapped less as the seasons went on. The beaver were thinning. The muskrat moved further from the breaks. Wolves, which had once been common enough to justify the risk of heavy steel traps, became scarce as the cattle operations that had survived the first winter expanded again and the poison campaigns that accompanied expansion did their work. He shifted. The trapper became a repairman, a wall man, a man you sent for when the chinking failed and the wind came through and the fire could not keep up. He carried a kit, rendered tallow in a sealed tin, sifted ash in a cloth bag, a flat stick for pressing, a knotted string for measuring the fire break, and a piece of muslin for emergency wrapping. The kit weighed 12 pounds. He walked with it to cabins, line shacks, stage stops, and the occasional barn across a range that extended 20 miles in every direction. He did not advertise. He did not need to. A man whose walls held through the winter of 1886 did not need to tell people what he could do. The walls told them. Lena improved the method twice more after that first spring. She discovered that adding a small amount of beeswax traded from a rancher's wife who kept 3 hives to the weather-face mixture produced a harder, glossier surface that shed water more effectively and was less attractive to rodents. The beeswax was expensive and not always available, but for cabins near timber where the risk of rodent damage was high, it was worth the cost. She also solved the summer problem that Orrin and Harlan had only partially addressed. South-facing walls coated with standard tallow-ash paste softened during July and August heat, and the surface developed a tacky film that collected dust and insects. Lena's solution was seasonal. In late spring, she applied a thin wash of lime water, not lime mortar, which was expensive and required hauling, but lime water made from a few ounces of quicklime dissolved in a bucket over the south-facing coating. The lime wash dried to a hard white surface that reflected sunlight and protected the tallow-ash layer beneath from direct heat. In autumn, the lime wash wore off naturally, and the tallow-ash surface beneath was intact. It was simple, it was cheap, and it worked because Lena understood, the way Orrin had understood, and the way Harlan had learned to understand, that a method was not a fixed thing. It was a starting point. The testing never stopped because the conditions never stopped changing. Tobe grew. He grew tall, then broad, then restless. By 16, he was running a small freight service with a mule team he had bought with 2 years of saved trapping money. He hauled lime, cloth, stovepipe, nails, and glass from Buffalo to the settlements along the breaks, the same 38-mile route that had once been the wall between Harlan and the materials he could not afford. He did not haul cattle. He did not work for ranchers. He had seen what the cattle industry did to the range and what the range did to the cattle, and he wanted no part of either end of that exchange. He hauled supplies to smallholders, to widows, to the families whose cabins he had helped seal, and he charged fair rates because Harlan had taught him that a fair rate paid twice, once in money and once in trust. He married at 20, a girl from Buffalo whose father ran a hardware store and who thought it was reasonable that a young man's hands should smell perpetually of tallow and ash because she had grown up around turpentine and linseed oil and understood that work left marks. The tallow-ash method did not last forever. Nothing built from animal fat and wood ash could compete with the materials that began arriving in the territory in the 1890s. Commercial caulking compounds, milled lumber for interior lining, Portland cement that set harder and faster than anything Harlan could mix in a kettle. By the turn of the century, most new construction used methods that made tallow-ash paste obsolete. But the old cabins remained. And in the draws and breaks where money was scarce and the nearest supply store was still a day's ride, the method survived for another decade, passed from hand to hand the way Harlan had received it, through work, not words, through testing, not gospel. Harlan and Lena remained near the Powder River breaks. They did not become famous. No Eastern paper printed his name. No government survey recorded the method. No patent was filed because you cannot patent tallow and ash mixed in a kettle and pressed into a crack with your fingers. The knowledge existed in the same place it had always existed, in the hands of people who needed it. Harlan died in 1909, in the spring, in the cabin he had sealed 23 years earlier. He was 59 years old. His hands were scarred from ashlie and cracked from cold, and stained dark from a lifetime of handling fat and charcoal and wood. Lena found him in the chair near the west wall, the same spot where Orrin had died, in the early morning before the stove needed feeding. She did not move him immediately. She sat on the pallet and looked at him and looked at the wall behind him. The tallow-ash coating had been replaced in sections over the years, patched, recoated, improved, but beneath the newer layers, if you scraped down deep enough, you could find the original paste from November of 1886. The first layer. The one Harlan had pressed into the north wall with bleeding hands while the sky turned green-gray and Calvin Strake's words echoed like a verdict. She buried him beside May and Orrin on the rise south of the cabin, under a flat stone from the creek. So. By the end of the second winter, 11 households in the Powder River breaks knew some version of the seal. Not all used pure tallow. Not all coated the full exterior. Some mixed in lime where they could get it, Some used clay cores with tallow weather faces. Some applied the coating only to the north wall, where the wind hit hardest, and left the rest to conventional chinking. But all of them understood the principle that Harlan had learned from an accidental spill and a dead mother's phrase. Wind is the enemy before cold. Cracks are fuel thieves. A cabin that cannot hold still air cannot be saved by a bigger fire. Harlan Voss did not leave a written record. He did not draw plans or publish measurements. He left sealed walls, taut hands, and the memory of a man who tested before he boasted and told the truth when a copy of his work failed. He died in the cabin he had built into something no one had seen before, a pale, smooth, greased shell that the valley had laughed at and then leaned on when the wind came. The winter of 1886 came down the Powder River breaks on a north wind that did not pause. It drove snow sideways across the flat. It killed cattle standing against drift fences. It cracked cottonwoods like gunshots. It poured through every gap in every wall and stole heat faster than any fire could replace it. Deacon Marr had ridden past the pale cabin in November and said, "Looks like a candle big enough for God to blow out." He was dead beside a drift fence before the week was over, but the cabin did not gutter. It did not open along the seams. It held its heat while the wind spent itself against a wall that had no cracks to enter. And years later, under the north eave, a faint pale ridge of old ash and fat remained where the wind had once tried to get in and found nothing. The valley remembered the joke. Harlan remembered the silence inside the walls.